everyone. We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Hinson.
And I'm Dr. Donnelly.
And we're back with our continuing coverage, intermediary coverage, in between our last show that we just covered, The Crown, and some Hallmark Christmas movies, and our next show, which will be Dietland. And we're recommending some of our favorite Netflix original content. So in our previous video, we talked about the amazing documentary series, The Keepers. And up on today's docket is, I'm going to try and pronounce his name correctly because I didn't realize until I watched this documentary that I wasn't, Hasan Minhaj. My best approximation. His first stand-up comedy film documentary on Netflix called Homecoming King.
Yeah.
And in short, it's wonderful and I love him. But we have a lot more articulate things to say than that. So it first premiered in 2017. So again, not something that premiered last year, but definitely one of our personal favorites for original content on Netflix.
Yeah. And so for anyone who is not familiar with Hasan, he is a correspondent on The Daily Show. Mm-hmm. And he is also now doing his own Netflix original series called Patriot Act.
Which is brilliant.
And he is a Indian Muslim American and first-generation immigrant. And largely this special is about the intersection of all of that.
Yeah.
He is also hyper-articulate and very quickly spoken.
Yes. Subtitles, if you must, because there were times where I didn't even understand him.
Yeah, I've watched it twice, and I definitely caught things the second time that I didn't catch the first time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, essentially, if you've watched a stand-up special, you've seen this one. This one doesn't involve any sex jokes or any inherent misogyny, and is instead this really lovely and just really surprising in a way the amount of vulnerability he has about growing up a first-generation Indian American in Davis, California. He is 2 years younger than we are, as he was revealing some dates about like when he graduated high school and things like that. So we're all around that like end of Gen X, beginning of millennial cusp, the Oregon Trail generation, as we like to refer to us.
Gritty veterans, I believe.
Gritty veterans of the millennial generation.
Gritty veterans we were referred to in a recent article on millennials, which I will take that nameplate. Thank you. I feel
like a gritty veteran.
I will put that on my business card.
So Hasan starts talking about his family, and then he moves on to talk about himself and a particularly formative experience that he had in high school. And I think that that's really good because he is not who he is without his family, and he's really clear about that. So the first, I'll talk about my kind of themes that I would love for us to kind of think about that has struck out to me both times we've said it. And then Dr. Hinson will add her personal. So my favorite thing is that there's an adage in comedy that I have learned from listening to comedy documentaries. Thank you, NPR and Glenn Weldon in particular, that the more specific something is, the more universal it actually is. So if you're trying to write something that you want people to relate to, it should actually be the most specific that you can get. Not overly detailed, specific, but like specific. So when he's talking about this bike that he wants for his birthday, for instance, when he's young, he doesn't just say, I wanted a bike and my dad took me to Home Depot.
Right.
He goes into, I wanted a blue BMX bike.
Toys R Us.
Toys R Us.
Shows you the ad for the exact BMX Toys R Us bike
that he had on his wall. And I was immediately 9 years old with my own, it was not a BMX bike, but with it was a Casio keyboard, with my own kind of thing. And in that way, we're all in the story with him. So that's not only a really good adage of comedy, that's a really good adage of storytelling. And to be frank, a really good adage of leadership too. When you're doing how you help people see their lives, you need to give specific examples instead of just, well, I hate that phrase. No one ever knows. No one ever knows.
Because they're not inside your head.
They don't know what's going on.
So you have to explain yourself.
Be specific.
Exactly.
And so then the next one that I loved about this is that every time Hasan talks, says something his father says, the first time he says it in his father's native tongue, which is either Hindi or another dialect of the subcontinent. I'm not fluent enough to know the difference. And then we'll translate kind of roughly for us, because that conversation is between him and his father. And I love that we got to hear that. And also just tying both of those things together, what the phrase I kept writing or thinking and writing was, he told, it was beautiful to hear different stories from different perspectives, but even more importantly, it was really important to hear the same story from different perspectives. We grew up in the same America and we didn't. And that was really, I was really honored that he was this articulate and this great storyteller, and he chose to tell stories about this. I also laughed so hard, so many times. Just the one-liners and it's if you enjoy laughing, we would recommend it.
If you enjoy comedy, we give it a thumbs up.
Yeah.
And I didn't watch Hasan on The Daily Show as much because I think the time he was on was when I is still on, but I don't watch it now as much, was when I was living abroad. So I didn't really know, I kind of knew of him colloquially, but I had never really watched his comedy before. And I started watching The Patriot Act because that just premiered on Netflix and I'd heard some people recommend it. And then we got to talking about what we wanted to cover, and Dr. Donnelly recommended Homecoming King, which preceded The Patriot Act. So for me, I got a little bit of a sense of his comedy from the Patriot Act, but really, Homecoming King is just like, because it's an hour and 12 minutes, you really like delve into him as a person. More so on his show, he kind of deals with one like theme of an episode. So there's an episode talking about, very specifically, we're talking about it before we started filming, Saudi Arabia and what's happening with the government. And so the entire episode is on that, not so much on Hasan. So what I loved was this cross-cultural exploration of who he was and how he was impacted by being an Indian American, by being a first-generation immigrant, by the differences between him and his father. But for me, what I loved is we spend a lot of time talking about art and who it is made for and who the audience is supposed to be. And we're both white ladies from middle-class backgrounds. A lot of the art that is made in America is made for white people, to tell white people's stories, and from that perspective. And so what I love about any time that I hear him talk is that he is coming from his own perspective. And this art is made for me because there's this universality, but it's also not my story in some ways. And so I deeply respect that while he explains a lot of the cultural differences, he doesn't explain all of them. And in that sense, it's not for me because it's not my story. There's universal elements that I understand, but other elements that I can't understand because I don't speak Hindi, or my parents don't speak Hindi, or I'm not Indian, or I'm not Muslim, or I'm not married to a Hindu woman, and all of these things that make him different than me. Just as if I was standing up there talking about what it's like to be an Irish American, there would be all of these cultural references. But of course, his is also layered with this complexity of racism and bigotry that I have never experienced as an Irish American, obviously. And that's the other thing that I think he deals with really, really well in this special, is the complexity of it. That we tend to talk about racism or discrimination or sexism or harassment or whatever in these really big instances, and he gives examples like, why do we only talk about racism when something like,
when there's a body count.
When there's a body count, when somebody dies, like Trayvon Martin, or any other, pick another unarmed black person that's been killed in the last several years. But we know those names and we know those stories because there's a body count, but we don't hear as many of the everyday stories. But it's implicit, it's everywhere, it pervades all of our lives, and he illustrates that through the stories that he tells, which I think is really, really important, because we talk a lot about how things happen in a culture all the time. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about harassment, we say, yes, there are these specific instances that happen, but you also have a culture of harassment, if that is being allowed to take place, if those incidents are taking place. And that's the same thing about racism and bigotry. We have these larger incidents happen because we have a culture of racism and bigotry that for a lot of people, white people especially, is very difficult to talk about. For a lot of legitimate or for a lot of illegitimate and some legitimate reasons. It's a difficult conversation to have, and I think he handles that complexity and the difficultness really well. So those were my two biggest takeaways. I love learning about different people and different cultures. And I loved how he didn't always explain himself, because he wasn't making this art for a white person to understand. He was just telling his story. And I thought that was brilliantly done.
And you talked enough about Indian food that I want to order for you tonight.
I would love a samosa or some biryani.
Yeah, we're going to crush some curry. So on that note, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Donnelly.
And I'm Dr. Hinson.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.